We'll spend the next hour or so talking about pricing ingredients. So we've emphasized, and Clive and Brooks have emphasized, the importance of trying to keep quantities and prices separate, which is, I think, one of the reasons, again, that we don't really want to rely upon budgets because they tend to be together in budgets. But I think we'll go into some reasons why it's useful to think about them separately in a way that's related. And we're going to use a running example. We decided to go crazy and be really creative here, and we have a math example as opposed to a reading example. Actually, and I should give credit here because the first few times we ran this training, I used some real programs that we've done, and there was a lot of complications to that. And then when my daughter was born, our colleague Yilin Pan, who's at the World Bank in DC now, she was sort of a pinch hitter for me, and she came up with this example, which is a made-up example. One of the most fun parts of doing this work, of doing the trainings and writing the textbook and things like that, has been making up programs. And so we've invented, with absolutely no qualifications whatsoever, we've invented a lot of different fictional math and reading and tutoring and computer-assisted instruction and all sorts of programs like that. So this one is totally invented, called Summing Up. I think my favorite we'll go into this afternoon that I made up for the textbook, actually, for an exercise there. It was a math tutoring program that I called Sigma, with an exclamation point. I don't know if anyone's interested, any textbook publishers, and I'll talk to you. But so Summing Up is essentially like a computer adaptive math remediation program. So it will kind of diagnose where students are having difficulty. Again, in theory, so don't get too excited if if this is just what you're looking for, is Summing Up. We're going to say that Summing Up was evaluated in 2013, 2014 in a New York City school, 100 students in grade 3. It was evaluated according to the STAR math assessment, and they did an RCT. So compared to the control group, they gained 0.15 standard deviations, which is, I think, a small to moderate sized effect. And so I think that really raises the question of, is this a worthwhile investment of resources? And so we would need to know what the costs are. How are we going to know the costs? Well, you will have already done, according to the last session, you have already gathered information about the ingredients. You have identified what the ingredients are. You've come up with some hypothesis based on a theory of action, based on program documentation. And then you've gotten some way, whether it's interviews or surveys, you've gotten information not just about the quantity, but also about the quality of the different ingredients. So we're going to pretend that's already been done and jump ahead and say that this is a very brief summary of what you maybe have gathered in your information about Summing Up. So you say that there were students, they were in groups of 20. They practiced math skills 30 minutes a day. Each group of 20 was supervised by a teacher. So there are 5 teachers for the 100 students, and they were in 5 different classrooms. The teachers participated in a 4-hour training session, and the program was there was a $100 per student license fee. That license fee included whatever fees there are associated with the teacher training. So the only cost we have associated with the teacher training then is the teacher time for the training. All right. So that's kind of a quick summary, and we're going to use this as a running example to get into some of the issues that you might face in pricing. Any questions about that so far? All right. So then you maybe take this information and you have some information about the quantity, and the information about the quantity is going to tell you how much of each ingredient. And then if you're going to want to assign a price to each of these ingredients, then you're going to need to know something about the qualities of the ingredients, something about the qualifications of the teacher, something about the characteristics of whatever facilities, equipment, things like that you're using. And so the quantity is pretty straightforward, or at least right now appears to be pretty straightforward. We have the number of licenses. We have the teacher time, both implementing the program and training. We have the time and the space for the classrooms. We need some computers because, again, it's a computer adaptive program. But we need to know something about maybe the qualifications of the teachers. We maybe need to know something about the size of the classrooms. Do the classrooms have any special characteristics? Is it, for instance, in a computer lab that maybe requires some sort of special facilities or special equipment? Similarly to the computers, we would want to know, well, something about, are these just any computers, or do you need particular specifications for the computers? How old are the computers, or how long do the computers last? Things like that. So when you gather the ingredients data before you get into pricing, you need to be able to anticipate what kinds of things you're going to need to know about the quality of the ingredients in order to assign a price. And this is something that I think also it gets easier with time. You start to really, especially once you start to become aware of what kinds of prices are available and what are the ranges of prices, and we'll see in the afternoon when we get into the cost tool and you see some of the 1,000 prices that Hank mentioned, and the 70 different prices we have for teachers, is, well, what would you want to know about the teacher in order to assign the appropriate price? And then sometimes you're going to need to make an assumption and perhaps do sensitivity analysis. Sometimes you're going to have to go back and do some follow-up questioning because you find that you thought you knew everything you needed to know from the quantity, and then when you try to assign a price, you realize that there are 5 different prices you might use and you're not sure which one, and so maybe you can ask a follow-up question in order to get the information you need. But this is really kind of how the ingredients data then sort of starts to map on to prices. So we're going to then take a step forward and say, where do we get the prices from? Right? If we got the ingredients from whatever methods we use for data collection, from surveys and interviews and all of that, we need to get the prices from somewhere. And so first we need to make a choice about overall, and I would agree with Brooks in response to your question, that I think it would be best to kind of make a global decision within a project, because you don't want to have a kind of mixture of different kinds of things within your estimate, because then you don't know if the costs are different because there's a real difference in resources, or if they're different simply because of the choices you made. And so I think that's a really good sort of general guiding principle as you're making decisions, as you're making assumptions, is, are we going to be able to separate differences, whether it's differences between sites, differences between programs, based on real resource differences, which is I think what we're really interested in, versus differences in just things related to the environment or differences in analytical choices we made or things like that. And so I think as we go through and towards the end of this session we're going to talk about adjustments you make to prices, then I think our kind of governing principle is going to be one of comparability. That we're going to want whatever the relevant decision is, whether it's within a single program, whether it's between different programs, that we want to have them all kind of on the same basis so that we can attribute differences in cost to differences in resources, not in, for instance, differences in how we discounted to present value or something like that. We want to be consistent with all of those things. Right? And so then the first choice we need to make is, do we use prices that are sort of local to the intervention or prices that are kind of national averages? Generally speaking, our preference is to use national averages, and that's for 2 reasons. One is the sort of obvious and aforementioned comparability, that if we're going to say, and also replicability. If we're going to say we're evaluating this program in New York City, then we might want to know how it compares to a program in Madison for the purpose of implementing it in Des Moines. And so therefore, we want to sort of abstract away from differences in the local market conditions in those areas and say, it's just sort of in resource terms, this is what this looks like, even though if someone in Des Moines were to actually choose to implement it, their costs in sort of dollar terms are going to look different because the labor market is different and things like that. And so that would be our preference. Even if you were going to use local prices, I think our guidance would be to still try to use market prices, not prices that I think Clive would characterize as idiosyncratic, right? It's very specific to the intervention, because those will have a lot of noise in them, right? They'll have a lot of kind of measurement error, or they'll have a lot of things that are not necessarily relevant to the intervention. For instance, a given individual's salary will include a lot of stuff in there. Again, a lot of kind of noise that's not really what we're interested in for the intervention. We're really interested in kind of what's the market value of what they're doing, and what would it cost to get somebody else to do what they're doing. And so therefore, even if we're going to use local prices, we'd say use local market prices, because then some of those idiosyncratic differences are going to wash out on average. If you choose to use national prices, then a good source is we have had a lot of folks over the years assemble prices from what we consider to be pretty high quality sources. So we have not done any of the kind of surveying ourselves, but there's a lot, particularly government agencies, the Current Population Survey, the National Center for Education Statistics, IPEDS. At the moment, I don't think there are any prices from the National Compensation Survey from the Bureau of Labor Statistics in the tool, but that's another good source to use. We've used actually prices that are a little bit more specific to education. We have prices from the National Education Association. But in general, what we've done is sort of scoured the available sources of high quality, nationally representative surveys looking for information about the prices of educational resources. And there are, as we'll see when we get into the tool this afternoon, there are multiple prices for many, many different types of ingredients, personnel, facilities, materials, everything. And you can select a price based on the qualities, the information you gather about quality, and then you can then vary that price using sensitivity analysis if you have any questions or doubts about that. Yes?
Yep. Will you say that fourth resource one more time? The one that may not be in the cost pool?
The National Compensation Survey, and that's the Bureau of Labor Statistics. Yes. I think there might be some BLS prices in there. Yes. Yes. Okay.
Especially with the updated prices.
Okay.
Some surveys stopped providing prices for free,
Uh-huh.
so we had to make the transition.
Okay, yeah. I think historically we didn't have as many BLS prices because, again, we were preferring kind of more education-specific surveys. It is a database of educational resources, but the BLS as a kind of general resource is just, I think Clive mentioned yesterday, it's just a great place to go for all sorts of data about anything related to labor markets and salaries and things like that. All right, so then you get your prices. So you've gathered this information, then you get your prices maybe from our database, maybe from some other sources, some other surveys. Maybe you do a survey yourself and get your prices. Then you're gonna, by the end of this, you're going to curse these red question marks that seem to keep propping up in my table here. They're the sort of these mysteries that keep happening. But now we have we have program licenses. There's 100 students, so it's pretty straightforward that there's 100 licenses, and we have teachers. We have 30 minutes per day per teacher during the academic year. We have 5 teachers. What's the quantity of that? So if we look at this information about the quantity, I see days, I see minutes, I see teachers, I see a year. There's a lot of different units there, right? And then we need to think about, well, what's the unit that's most relevant here? Are we interested in a number of teachers? Are we interested in amount of time? And that is going to depend in part on what's the price that we have. Right? We might have a price that is like an annual salary that would map onto a full-time equivalent, and then so we can translate all of this into some number of teachers. Or we might have a price that's kind of a unit of time, like a kind of like man hours, and then we would map that onto an hourly wage. And so those things should actually be mathematically equivalent. You can transform the price from an annual salary to an hourly wage, or you can transform the ingredient, right, from some sort of number of hours to FTEs, which would be like kind of a number of people over a course of a year. And either way you do it should be the same, but either way you have to make a choice. And the choice is how many hours are there in a year? right? And so the Bureau of Labor Statistics says there's 2,080 hours in a year. I think the clock and the calendar say there's 8,760 hours in a year. But most teachers' contracts say there's about 1,440 hours in a year. In higher ed, I think most contracts, which are 9 months typically, say there's 1,260 hours in a year. And so we need to know, if we're making this transformation, what's the sort of basis for whatever the original number we're looking at is, and then make that transformation based on that. And if we're not sure, then this is, I think, an area where we could do sensitivity analysis, because you could see that if you're wrong, if you're not sure if your price is based on a calendar year or an academic year, then you could be really wrong, right? That this could be off by almost a factor of 2. And so this is an area where I think it's pretty important to get it right, or at very least to do a sensitivity analysis to see if that's going to affect your decisions. Questions about that?
Question.
Yes.
So, you know, especially in a situation like this where they say that they do it every day,
Mm-hmm.
but in a school year, I mean, you probably at the beginning of the year can figure out, you know, there are testing days, there are field trips, there are, you know what I mean? There are certain days where it's just not going to happen.
Sure.
And so to think 180 days, you know, to calculate it based on 180, you know, off the bat is going to be unrealistic. So
Sure.
Sure.
And it depends. So the answer to your question, I think, depends on whether we're talking about the numerator or the denominator. And so I think if we're talking about the denominator, if we're saying we're going to divide an annual salary into an hourly wage, then I think regardless of whatever other things the teachers are doing over those 180 days, we still want to account for all those 180 days, because that's kind of the basis for their salary, and then some percentage of that time is then going to be devoted to this program. But I think if we're talking about the numerator, then that's an area where we'd probably want to try to dig in and get some more information and say, you know, well, when you say every day, you know, do you mean every single day? Are there exceptions, things like that? So I think to some extent it's like kind of like an empirical question. But then if we're thinking about it just purely in terms of making this adjustment between an annual salary and an hourly wage, then we'd say, regardless of what else they're doing or how much time they devote to the program or what their other responsibilities are, we're still going to say that their annual salary is based on a 180-day school year. And so we'll use that across the board. Yes?
But I mean, to that point, you're saying as much as possible do it as implemented, not as intended.
Yes.
That's what you said.
Yes, I'd say that's a good general rule. Yeah. Because we want to say, remember the guiding question, the sort of, I think the thing when you're in doubt about a specific decision, the general principle to return to is what did it take to get this effect? And so yeah, going back to as implemented, I think is the best way to go. Other questions? Do you have a follow-up?
I'm trying to compare it to like intent to treat and
Yeah.
whether it makes sense or not.
Yeah, so I think Clive might talk about this when he talks about cost effectiveness. There is a connection to intent to treat and treatment on the treated, although this is more in the area of when we think about cost effectiveness ratios and we think about kind of, well, what's the sort of basis for our effectiveness measure, and then we need to kind of match the cost basis to that. So yes, I think that's a good connection, but Clive's going to talk more about that, I think, tomorrow. Yes. All right, so then once we've made that decision and we have all of our units lined up and we've made the necessary conversions, then we might run into some other kinds of issues. There are some areas where it can be difficult to find the right price. It can be difficult to adjust the price, things like that. So one thing is there are some ingredients for which there may not be a market, or may not be a national market. There may not be a competitive market. I think the best example for that is educational facilities, where the most straightforward way to account for educational facilities would be a rental rate. Right? We'd say, well, even if you don't have to pay rent on this classroom, if you're a school district to implement an after-school tutoring program, you could have collected rent on it if you weren't doing this program here. So that's the opportunity cost. The issue is that, so I actually dug into this for a paper I'm working on with Brooks, and I want you to take a guess. I did it's not a random sample at all. I did a convenience sample of about 20 school districts across the country and tried to figure out, well, what would they charge to rent out their classroom space? And I want you to guess, what's the cheapest district in the country? It's a big city for renting out classroom space.
Per classroom.
Yeah, for a classroom. What's the
entire
city?
classroom.
Yeah. To rent out a classroom for an hour. Which city would be the cheapest?
I'm gonna guess New York too.
Yeah. So I mean, you're right that it's a trick question. It's San Francisco. It's $7 an hour to rent a classroom in San Francisco. I'm going to look into living in a classroom in San Francisco. So the most expensive, Cincinnati, Ohio. So anyway, I don't think the market for renting educational facilities is a really transparent, competitive market. This does not seem to be like a well-functioning market. So therefore, we don't typically use rental rates for educational facilities. We use new construction prices and then annualize them, which is more work and requires more assumptions. But even though you can, and if you're using local prices, you might be able to look and say, well, what's the rental rate? And a lot of school districts just post it on their website. Again, I found a convenient sample of about 20 school districts. But I was very surprised. But yeah, $7 an hour for a classroom in San Francisco. Yes.
Can you use something like, if you get a budget from a school, we're talking in the small group, and typically every school will have like facility maintenance line,
Yeah.
right? Like heating, water, braking, hiring repairmen, all those kinds of things. Can that be sort of your baseline, because the school is already there, somebody else bore the cost of building it, so, but the maintenance is yearly expense bore by the school or the school district?
I'd say you want to include both, because even though the school's already there, they could be using the space for another program. So we still want to account for the opportunity cost of the space. But yes, so something else I've looked into for the paper I'm working on with Brooks now is the national average for overheads. So rather than kind of itemizing ingredient by ingredient, some kind of small utilities and maintenance overheads, even some general administrative overhead, if it's not the principals involved in the day-to-day management of the program, which if that were the case, we'd absolutely want to account for the principal's time as an ingredient, but rather maybe in a higher ed program, there's just kind of general payroll and HR and things like that, then that I think you could just apply a percentage. And if I remember correctly, I don't, it's off the top of my head, but the census have a survey about school finance and about kind of educational expenditures, and they do collect data nationally about how much school districts spend on maintenance and facilities overhead, and it's about 9% of the facilities budget goes into maintenance overhead, and so yeah, I would say include both. So don't substitute, but add it in. Yeah. Other question about that? Yes.
How carried away are you getting with this? I mean,
Yeah.
are you including furniture? Are you including, carpet?
Right. Yeah. So that's another great question. And so there's a sort of another principle that Hank likes, which is we say don't count paper clips. That we're not going to be really there's certainly a point of diminishing returns in terms of the cost of data collection versus how much better your estimates get, and you have to make a decision about kind of where that trade-off lies for you. And so I think there's some value in getting fairly detailed about the costs, even if it's not buying you all that much in terms of a better estimate. And that is that if you're going to be doing an evaluation and reporting back to somebody, whether it's a funder or the program developers, things like that, there is, I think, great value in face validity. And just saying, I have accurately described this program. And so, you can trust my cost estimates because these are what I say the ingredients of the program are, and these strike a reasonable person as an accurate description of the ingredients. So I think that's a decent rule of thumb to follow. But I think another one is absolutely think about what's the relative share of the cost and how likely is an ingredient to change a decision. And if it's only 1% of the cost, which means that if you're wrong by a factor of 2 or a factor of 5, then you're only off, your final cost is only off by 2 or 5%, then maybe you don't want to put that much effort into that ingredient. You want to kind of allocate your effort according to the proportion of the total cost. Yes?
I just, based on what you said, I know that my school district rents out classrooms and our gym, and all the churches rent our auditoriums on the weekends and everything. But I haven't looked at this in a long time, but just to share, there's a lot of different rates. If it's a nonprofit educational activity, you pay one rate. If it's a nonprofit recreational activity, but it depends on whether it's for education, whether it's recreational, whether you're making a profit. There's a rate for government. There's a rate for profit. There's one for for-profit revenue generating. And my district is really good at making things complicated, but there's at least 12 different rates depending, what you're charged depends on the activity and whether you're trying to make money or not. So I'm trying to bring it into my program evaluations. If we're using our own facilities, I'm not sure which one of these I would pick.
Yeah, and I think that's another sign that this is not a functioning market, because the opportunity cost to the district does not vary based on what the space is used for. So, yeah.
I'm sorry, I have to jump in here because a lot of these questions are confusing the finance, who pays versus the cost.
Right.
The cost doesn't change because there's a subsidy from either philanthropy or from the district. So we really have to separate that. The same is true with the cost of the facility. What is the value of that facility? What is the opportunity cost? That's the cost. The question of how it's financed, was it financed 20 years ago by selling bonds, things like that? That is a different issue. And so what we need to do is to separate in our minds the concept of cost as opposed to who bears the cost or how are the costs covered, okay?
Yes.
So, a project I'm working on it's a summer learning program, and these programs, the space is donated, but obviously we still have to figure out the cost. But in this situation, you have some of the programs that are in, these are programs for low-income kids, but the summer learning happens at fancy private schools. So you have fancy private schools, or you also have them at community colleges and universities, and so there's very clear delineation. There are certain programs that at this one place and certain programs, and I would think from an outsider saying, do I want to implement this program, I would want to know what the cost, what the difference is. Like if you average them together, it's not particularly helpful if the cost is that different.
Sure.
So,
and I think that can be a sort of separate analysis. So you can say that there's a value of the space, right? There's an opportunity cost to using space. Now, one question you might have is, if there are multiple sites and they have different kinds of facilities, and those different kinds of facilities have different characteristics, and those have different values and a different opportunity cost, is that somehow affecting the effectiveness? Like and would maybe people want to replicate it at the private school sites, or maybe they have better facilities and that's making it more effective? And then I think you would want to account for those differences in a kind of site level analysis. The other way you could do it is you can kind of do a sort of a general cost and say sort of this is the average opportunity cost. You need the space, and this is sort of on average what that space is worth. But then you could do a separate financing analysis, and you could do a separate almost like kind of sensitivity analysis and say, well, if you were going to do it in this kind of space, this is what it would cost versus this kind of space. And so you can sort of show the distribution there. Yeah.
I'm sorry, I'm not trying to be difficult. I want to learn and understand. I just compared the price difference. Now, if you were renting our facility for profit, a classroom is $100 an hour in my district. Okay, and like if you rent a gym or an auditorium, it's $250 an hour for profit. Now, if it's a nonprofit for educational purposes, a classroom is only $4.50 an hour. and you could rent a gym or an auditorium, and I don't know how they came up with this for $27.89 an hour. How they came up with $27.89, if it's a nonprofit educational activity. So when I do my analysis on facility usage, I mean, if the price is ranging anywhere from $4.50 an hour to $100 an hour, what do I put on my chart?
Yeah, so you need to approximate the true value. Yeah, so what's the opportunity cost? So this is to Hank's point about what different people are paying is affecting kind of the distribution of who pays. So if for-profit entities are paying much more for the space, that means that they are effectively then subsidizing the district. If nonprofit educational entities are paying much less for the space, that means the district is somehow subsidizing them. And somewhere in the middle is the true value of the space, and that's what you want. You want to account for what's the opportunity cost of using this space.
So really, I need two columns. I need to have like a low end anywhere from $100 an hour to $250 an hour, or I'm sorry, anywhere from $4.50 an hour all the way up to $250 an hour, and just say that it's somewhere in this range.
Yeah, I mean, I think you can probably get a little closer than that. That's a really crazy range. But yes, I think you.
I couldn't make this up.
Yeah, I think you'd want to drill down a little bit more to what type of space it is. So you could say whether it's a classroom versus a gymnasium or auditorium, and so you could sort of separate out that question, because those spaces will indeed have different values. And then I think, yeah, reporting a range and doing a sensitivity analysis would make some sense in this case. But if you can somehow get at, again, what's the real value? And maybe in this case, you don't use the rental rates, because the rental rates are there's just too much else mixed up in there.
Right.
And then just use the sort of annualized construction costs. And that gives you a sense of what the real value is.
Okay.
And then you can see, there's some subsidies happening there. Yes.
So I'm struggling with this the same concept, and maybe I'm thinking about it the wrong way of opportunity costs, but we were talking about opportunity costs in terms of what that space, if we're talking about
Mm-hmm.
space, could be used for if it weren't used for this program. And if the cost of that space can vary from $450 to $100,
Exactly.
and you're saying that the cost really doesn't vary, it shouldn't vary. It seems like in this case it actually does, that the opportunity of renting that space out could vary widely. And so how do you, I'm struggling with thinking, how do you understand the true value in a circumstance?
So there's two ways to think about this. So one, the more conservative approach is to say that from an opportunity cost perspective for the district, the most valued opportunity of that space is to rent it to a for-profit entity and get $100 an hour. And so you could say, just go with the maximum and say, you could be getting $100 an hour for this space, so therefore that's what it's worth to you. I don't think that's really the best way to go, because number one, I'm not so sure that they're attracting a lot of people renting classroom spaces for-profit businesses for $100 an hour. Like, I don't think that's a real market price. So I think that's part of the issue here. The other way to think about it is that, this space has some value, right? And the value is its next best alternative usage. And maybe we sort of separate out the question of the rental fees and things like that, and just say, if you need to build the space in order to have this program, what would that cost you?
Again, I want to emphasize that we're confusing in the questions finance, how something is paid for versus what its value is. One way of getting some neutrality on this space is to say, what would it lease for in this particular area? I mean, Wake County has a lot of space like this. It's air conditioned. Could be central, in a central area in one of the cities. Could be out in the suburbs. But what we do is go to one of the major real estate firms and say, what does space like this lease for per square foot? That would give us a pretty good picture of the market. We're not dealing with finance. How's it going to be paid for? Maybe we can't pay for it at all. We wouldn't say it's worth zero then. Or maybe, you have this particular set of prices and things, but the main thing here is please don't confuse how something is going to be financed from what its actual cost is. And a lot of these questions are really mixing the two. We want to know, what is the value? What is the true cost? Remember, Brooks brought up the issue of replication. What is it going to cost to replicate a particular intervention? And now we're just looking and saying, well, there's some ingredients that are needed, and we're going to identify those ingredients. That's neat. Next question is, what is the cost of these ingredients? We haven't said anything about whether we're profit, non-profit, relationships with other outsiders or anything like that. And what you do is, this life is really much simpler, I think, than you think. It goes in steps. Now, once you can figure out what the costs are, the next question is, who's going to bear the costs? How are they going to be paid for? But by the way, it's natural to mix the two. Whenever we go and ask for cost, what happens is some accountant or bookkeeper says, oh, well, the cost of the program was this. Gets that from expenditures, budgets, or things, doesn't even have a clue what that absolutely includes, because that person is confusing the financing with the actual cost. So we stand back and we say, what are the costs before we figure out who pays for them, whether they're going to be subsidies for some groups that the district is going to cover, basically, whether they're going to be surpluses for other groups, which the vendor is going to be adding above the actual cost. There are mechanisms for determining the cost, and we want to stay with that before we look at the question of who's going to finance it and how.
So is there a place you can go to find the annualized construction cost?
There is, yes. You can go to Cost Out, and it is there. Yes. Yes. Excellent question. So just a couple of other quick things about some sort of tricky pricing issues. So sometimes there's just not a national market, or there's no like kind of survey. Like I don't think there's a survey for the national price of pens. But if you go to like Amazon.com or someplace like Walmart, I mean, I think that first of all, these are going to be very small shares of the cost. So again, if you're off by a lot, then your final estimate's only off by a little. But secondly is a lot of these things, I think the sort of market has become nationalized in a sense, whereas labor and facilities are the two areas where the markets are still very, very local, and you're going to find a lot of variation in costs there. But for pens, certainly, I think the cost of a pen in New York is very similar to the cost of a pen in Des Moines. So you might also run into the issue where there's just, you really just need that ingredient, that you need this particular curriculum, this particular book, this particular training, things like that. So there's not really like a huge competitive national market. That's one specific thing. I think in general, I'd say just use the price of that thing and then say, well, if anyone wants to do this anywhere across the nation, this is what this is going to cost. And you could potentially try applying regional geographic price adjustments to that if you think there might be some regional variation there. Some programs involve a lot of travel. That can be really difficult to imagine what kind of average travel looks like. But there are, in fact, national trade publications that will tell you things like national average airfare, hotel rooms, things like that. And I already mentioned some stuff about administrative overhead. Some other ingredients, so I think Brooks addressed the issue of volunteer time and how we price that pretty well. We have client inputs, also I think very similarly to volunteer time in terms of thinking about parental time. It could be a little trickier to think about student time in general. For younger students, we generally don't ascribe an opportunity cost to the value of their time. I think part of the idea of that is that, number one, in economics, typically the opportunity cost of doing something like an after-school program is foregone wages, but they have no foregone wages. And secondly is the programs are designed to serve them, right? And so they're participating voluntarily in something that is a service to them, then we can presume that they're getting some value out of it. So we don't necessarily need to attribute a cost to their time. So we typically don't have a kind of opportunity cost for student time, at least in K-12 interventions. But you might consider that for something like a community college intervention where students are maybe doing some more remediation where they could have been working. And so there is a very real cost to them. And again, the guiding question is one of replication, right? So you need, for instance, students to be available to come in at this time in order for the program to work. You need parents to be available to come to conferences or something like that for a program to work. So therefore, we should account for the value of their time. Yeah.
The parental time is in the evening. Do we just make an assumption that they're missing work, like think that they could be working in the evening and as a conservative?
Yeah, generally speaking, the opportunity cost of time is always foregone wages, regardless of when that time is happening. Yeah. And then what do you use for those foregone wages? You use minimum wage, you use sort of the median wage in that area, and I think that's going to depend on the nature of your program and the sample you're looking at and things like that. Yeah. Other questions about that? Yes.
What do you do in terms of if you were doing a cost analysis of this program, you could put in your time
Sure.
and Brooks's time, but the idea of replicating it doesn't really make sense because there's only one teacher's college. Do you account for that, or do you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, oh, absolutely, and we do run into that pretty frequently. So, for instance, when we did our social emotional learning paper, and also when we did our early literacy paper, a lot of these programs, particularly like Positive Action, relies really heavily on Carol Allred, who is one very specific person who lives in Oregon, and she actually comes and personally visits all of the Positive Action sites. So we do struggle a little bit with how do we account for you need a Carol Allred, and there's not necessarily a market price for that. I think we still would say, well, this person has this type of experience and these qualifications and this training and all of that, and say, well, what's the market value of a person with those kinds of qualifications? And then I think we would just sort of qualitatively describe, we don't necessarily account for that in the price or the cost, but more of a qualitative description and say, we think that the results are partly driven by sort of the unique capacities of some of the people who are involved, and they may need some sort of specialized skill or training or things like that. So yeah, sometimes it's just not always possible to quantify.
The cost of her, if she wanted to train 5 other people to get up to her level, could be perhaps, I don't know, astronomical,
Right. Yes.
Sort of building on that. So several of these things that you've been talking about have been very local in terms of student time or parent time, what's the average wage, facilities. But earlier you recommended that we should focus on national pricing if possible. So I'm wondering how you reconcile this.
Yeah, so for my recommendation would definitely be to use national averages, and for facilities, then we would use the new construction costs for that. And then, for parental and student time, then I would use a national minimum wage or a national median wage, things like that. So when I say local, and so this winds up being a little bit tricky because we're thinking about the ingredients as being very local, right? Because the quantities of the ingredients and the description of the ingredients, those are pretty idiosyncratic. And those are really, again, driven by this question of replication, this question of what did it take to get that particular impact in that particular implementation. I think one of the values of this method is it's very kind of empirically close to the ground, and it really helps you see what happened and what led to the effect. The prices are generally going to be national, and that's the part where we're thinking about generalizing. And so there's a little bit of a discrepancy there, but I think there's some logic to that discrepancy.
So the annual construction prices are actually national?
Yes, they are. Yeah. They come from School Planning and Construction magazine, and they did a survey. So yeah. Yep. All right. I'm going to skip over the rest there because I want to jump into, we're going to do a couple of sort of mini exercises of ways you might need to adjust prices to make them comparable. The good news is this afternoon when we see cost out does all of this for you automatically. but I think there is great value in kind of seeing what's happening behind the scenes and getting some understanding of what cost out is doing. So the first thing is, so we came up with our quantity estimates. Maybe we decided to go with hourly hours for teachers' time. And now we have an annual wage, and we're going to divide it by 1440, so that's a 180-day school year. But now we need to apply fringe benefits. And so most of the prices in cost out, they're wages, but they don't have benefits. But we also in cost out have average fringe benefits expressed as a percentage of wage. Something to be careful of is sometimes benefits are reported as percent of total compensation. And so that's not going to be the same as a percent of a wage because the kind of pie you're looking at is a little bit different. And so if you see, let's say, 25% benefits as a percentage of total compensation, then you need to divide that by 0.75 because the whole denominator there is not the wage. And so 25% of total compensation is 33% of wages. But I think the key is just to be aware of whether you're looking at a percentage of wage or a percentage of total compensation. So the first thing is we're going to apply fringe benefits. Then we notice, more of this dreaded red ink here, then we notice that the prices are coming from 2007, 2010, 2013, 2015. And we know that prices in general increase over time. That's a phenomenon known as inflation. And the nominal prices, so prices just expressed in a particular time period, from one year are not comparable to nominal prices in another year because they don't just reflect changes in value, they also just reflect changes in overall level of prices. So we're going to need to make an adjustment for that. That's pretty straightforward. The Bureau of Labor Statistics collects something called the Consumer Price Index. In the Consumer Price Index, we can use the ratio of that to convert price in our target year. So we convert everything to the same year from the price in our base year. And so if we just do some algebraic rearrangement, then we get this pretty simple formula. In most cases, you can just use the CPI. I'll give you a couple of exceptions. There are several things, particularly I think cars and technology, that actually don't get more expensive over time, they get cheaper over time. I'll tell you, it was around the year 1990 that we got our first home computer, which was a 386. It was about 1% as powerful as like an Apple Watch now. And I think it was somewhere in the neighborhood of $2,500, which if you trust my parents is about $4 million in today's money. But now you can buy nearly the most powerful machine on the market for less than that, even at the time where prices overall in the economy have nearly doubled. And so technology is sort of an exception to the rule. If you're using a technology-intensive intervention over a long time horizon, then you might want to do something different. But in almost all cases, just using the CPI is OK. So let's do a really quick mini exercise and see if you can convert our $100 in 2013 to $2016. And so this is the CPI in 2013. This is the CPI in 2016. So what would this be in 2016 dollars? Are you really good at mental math? Yeah. Yep, 101.90. So there has not been a lot of inflation. We're in a sort of slow recovery from a recession and all of that. So inflation's been really low over the last couple of years. So $100 in 2013 is $101.90 in 2016. So again, if you do use the cost tool, it will make this adjustment for you automatically. You just say what you want your target year to be, and then if you use prices in the tool, then it knows what the base year is for each of those, and it will automatically convert all of those into your target year. Yes?
Could you go back just 2 slides?
Two.
One more.
Mm-hmm.
Could you help me understand, because I'm starting to get this cost price thing a little more fuzzy in my head. Why did you have, like, for classrooms, we have 450 hours, why don't you have like the hourly cost of a typical classroom instead of, why does it say hourly price? Can you help me?
Oh, so what we want is the is a cost. So the cost is the price times the quantity. And so here, all of these, so this whole session is just about getting the prices. And then, right, exactly, yeah. Yep, yeah, so the cost would just be the price times the quantity. Other things? All right, so if we're not going to use a rental rate, then we're going to need to use a new construction price, and then we're going to need to annualize that. And so this is through a process. Sometimes it's called amortization or depreciation, although those mean subtly different things. So I think I'll use annualization because it's kind of the most general term to cover these things. But there's a couple of kind of rationales for this. One is capital investments are often financed through borrowing, and so they're often paid back, especially school districts. They're often paid back, for instance, like a 30-year bond issue or something like that to build a new school building. So this is partly kind of incorporating some of that. Although again, we do want to separate out questions of finance from questions of the costs. It would also be, though, overstating the cost of an intervention to say you need to build a whole new building for this intervention, and then you're only using it for 1 year, right? You're just using it for this intervention, and then, I don't know, you tear it down or something. And so instead, we want to try to charge, sort of thinking of it as like charging by year for the useful life of a building, also taking into account that if you hadn't invested in that building, you could have invested in something else, right? And so that's what this really complicated formula does. You never need to look at this again because, again, the tool will do this for you automatically, but this is an annualization formula that's doing those two things, right? Taking into account the opportunity cost of investing and then also dividing a capital investment into the useful life. So we need to know what's the useful life, and we need to know what's the interest rate that you could have gotten on the market or that maybe you're paying on bonds to finance the construction of this. I think the only tricky thing here is that we also apply this to human capital, not just physical capital. And so we say if a program involves a lot of training, then we don't want to attribute all the costs of the training to the first year of the program because that's going to overstate the first year cost, even if the training is all happening during the first year, because there's a useful life of the training. And what's the useful life of a training? Well, it's when do you need to repeat the training? Either because people have forgotten they need a refresher course, or because you have a lot of turnover and you have new staff that you need to retrain. And so we will typically annualize training costs in addition to physical capital. Questions about that? All right. So then the other thing, and so these are 3 separate issues. So I want you to keep it all clear in your heads. Inflation, annualization, and present value, they all relate to time, but they are all completely separate. Right? So it's best to think of them as 3 completely separate things. But in a multi-year program, costs and benefits are going to occur at different times. And at least in theory, costs and benefits that happen at different times have different values. Why is that? Well, it's because it's not inflation. I think a lot of people think it's inflation, but it's not. It's because of time preference. It's because very consistently, there's been a lot of empirical work in this area, very consistently people strongly prefer to receive $1 now over receiving $1 a year from now. There's all sorts of reasons for that, like if you receive $1 now, you could invest it, right? And you could have made interest on it versus a year from now. Also, you may not know if you or the world or whatever is going to be around a year from now. So there's a question of risk as well. So what we need to do is we need to discount. We need to discount to present value, right? So we need to say, okay, these dollars, these costs, or these benefits that are happening in the future, we need to say, well, what would they be worth today? What is it worth to you today for me to promise that I'm going to give you $1 in a year, right? And it's not going to be $1. What it's going to be is you're going to have this discount rate. And there's a whole literature, it's very, very complicated, about selecting an appropriate discount rate. If you read a textbook on cost-benefit analysis, it's probably going to devote like 100 pages to selecting a discount rate. I'll summarize for you. Say use 3.5%. There's something called a social discount rate. I mean, you can and should think about it and look into it. I don't want to be glib about it. And it's also one of the areas where you could do sensitivity analysis, is varying the discount rate. But in general, we use a social discount rate. The social discount rate is lower than the individual discount rate because they're kind of collectively, as a society, we're more future focused than any individual is. We're more risk tolerant than any individual is as a society. And so therefore, we use a lower discount rate. Individual discount rates are sometimes as high as like 20%. But yeah, for social discount rate, the Office of Management and Budget recommends values between about 3 and 7%. I think you can also think about things like the interest rate on treasury bonds as a kind of guidance for what kind of discount rate to use. But we generally use 3.5%. I think in general, it doesn't make a huge difference within a relatively narrow range, and there is some value in just being consistent for comparability. And so that's why we recommend that. So this is if you discount discretely once a year. You can also say discounting is happening more often. It's happening monthly, it's happening weekly, it's happening daily. And if you take that to the extreme and say discounting is happening continuously, then you use this formula where this is the constant E. And that's actually one of the, for math nerds, that's one of the ways to derive the constant E, is to say if you take the limit as the number of periods approaches infinity, this is what you come up with. And so this is like an exponential decay formula. Again, the tool will do this for you automatically. Excel will do this for you automatically. There's a function in Excel, it's just PV, I think, that will do this for you automatically. But this is what it's doing. Okay. Questions about that? All right. So then we're going to say in year one, so we're going to call year one times 0 for this exercise. So we're going to say that assume that sort of we're talking about the start of year one, which means now. So what is $100 worth? And then year two, what is $100 worth to us? So $100 a year from now, what is that worth to us now? And so using a discount rate of 3.5% in discounting continuously, if you have Excel, again, you can use the present value function, or you can use C here is the amount, $100. And then E, there's a function in Excel, EXP, and that's an exponential function that will take E, and then you can specify the rate here is 3.5%, so 0.035, and then 1 minus T, so year one is T in this case, and then year two in this case, T is 2. So who can tell us what's $100 in year one worth to us now? And this one is a little bit of a trick question. Yes, yes. So there, yeah, you could say, well, I said year one is starting now, and so $100 now is worth $100 now. Or also, if we say T is 1, and we say 1 minus 1, then that is raised to the 0 power, which means this is 1. And so $100 times 1 is $100. Okay. And then for year two, I'm gonna skip ahead because I don't think you need to go through the arithmetic. But if we say this is going to be 1 minus 2, so this is going to be negative 1. So 0.035 times negative 1 e to that power times 100, that's $96. So $100 a year from now is worth $96.50 now. Right? And again, the tool will do this for you, but just I think it's helpful to see what's happening. All right, so basically in summary from this morning, so you're going to do what Brooks told you to do step one, to gather the ingredients data. And then you're going to price the ingredients, so you have to select whether you're going to use local or national prices. You align the units. You're going to make adjustments for inflation, for benefits, for annualization, for present value. We didn't talk about for geographic area, but if you use national prices, but then you want to say, well, what would it be in Des Moines? Then you can, it's very similar to inflation, just like they have the consumer price index, which is based on a basket of goods and looks at kind of overall how prices are changing nationally. The Bureau of Labor Statistics also, I think it's BLS, it might actually be another government agency, but they have something called regional price parities, where they collect baskets of goods in different places and then look at how those prices vary. There's also something that Lori Taylor at UT Austin constructs called the CWI, the Comparable Wage Index. And that is education specific, and it's constructed for every school district in the country. It's looking at, it's based on outside opportunities for teachers. So it's looking at basically non-teaching salaries. It's saying, based on that, how does the cost of teachers, the cost of educational workers vary across school districts in the country. So if you're using national prices but then want to try to express it in a local area, then you can use a geographic adjustment. I didn't go through the mechanics of how to do that again because it's the same as adjusting for inflation, basically. And then this afternoon, we'll talk about the next step, which is analysis. Yes?
I have a question about kind of implementation of the program. So we took into account the total amount of time that the teachers are working with the kids, but how do you take into account like any prep time that's
Yeah, so
like, and for some teachers it's going to be a lot longer. For some teachers, maybe they're really quick at it or just don't care. But
yeah, so I think you would try to gather that information. Like I think you would try to include prep time in your ingredients, and when you were gathering the ingredients data, you would try to capture some sense of either the range, sort of the distribution of prep time, and maybe include like the average or something like that. But yeah, I would say that that's a really important component of the program, and therefore you should sort of think of it like an ingredient and try to gather as much information about it as you can. Other questions? So this is just a quick summary. We're not going to go through it because it's everything I just said, but you'll have the slides so you can have this as a reference, which will hopefully be useful for you to go back to.